Hello, everyone, and welcome to Power Brain, Power Life. The purpose of this interview series is to a little bit break up some misconceptions about the brain and brain science and neuroscience. The biggest one being that the brain just stops growing, that you stop learning. We now know that our brains are one of the most complex tools in the universe. They're constantly changing and learning and adapting. So how can we leverage what we know about the brain, what we've learned in the past 10 years, and how can we make our lives better? Certainly the reason I do this is because my life is just exponentially better just with some basic understandings of how the brain works. My guest today is the director at the Wharton Neuroscience Initiative and professor at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Platt, thank you so much for the time today to discuss brain science and focusing on job searches. So welcome.
Thank you. It's really great to be here, and Happy New Year to you and to all your listeners.
So the question is, you wrote a terrific book. I've got it right here on just leadership and how the brain works and effective leaders, but really want to focus on, as I mentioned, on job searching. It's a good time of the year. What have we learned about, searching for a job, whether you have a job or unemployed? It can be such a stressful experience. What have you learned in your studies and your experience about how to best approach finding and landing that right job?
Yeah, I mean, this is a super important question, especially right now with so much upheaval in the economy, so much uncertainty, so much turnover in the kinds of jobs and careers that are out there, and we don't really know what's kind of coming around the bend. So it's there are many things, right, that really make this a challenging time, but also I think a time of great opportunity. I mean, last year Amazon hired 500,000 people, right? So there's things are happening, but things are happening at a breakneck pace as well. So neuroscience, the application of neuroscience in business is very new. Of course, scientists have been studying the brain for hundreds of years. And as you said, it's the most complex organ in the known universe. So, we're at a point where I think we know enough about brain function, how it works kind of on average in each person, and how it works a little bit differently in each individual, and how it responds to the environment to give some tips, I think, kind of overall to people, but also potentially and this is really what motivates me, is to give people the tools to know themselves a little bit better, a little bit more precisely, and in that way, perhaps find their way to a career path that better suits who they are, and therefore is makes them happier, makes them more satisfied, makes them more productive, and basically have a better life. And so that's sort of the overall mantra, the overall approach. I mean, I think different people will approach this in I think very different ways. And as you said, the stress part of this can certainly be very challenging. So I think part of responding to that is knowing what the opportunities are. So kind of putting yourself in what I would call a forager's mindset, which is kind of recognizing that maybe what you've got, although it's giving you some returns, might be leading you into a blind spot where you might not recognize that there are better opportunities somewhere else. And this is actually kind of one kind of fundamental aspect of the way we're wired that I talk about in the book, which is that we have essentially two systems in the brain. There are multiple systems, but two that are kind of like a yin yang in terms of like sticking with what you've got. What the Clash saying about, should I stay or should I go? So sticking with what you've got, your current partner or whatever, or taking the plunge and looking for something new. And it kind of turns out that when your mind is sort of set on one of those, focusing on what you've got, it's very hard to break out and look for something new. And so you kind of got to get out of that rut. And there are a number of internal and external factors that can promote getting out of that rut. I mean, just uncertainty itself can do that. But I think kind of opening your mind, if you will, consciously to the wealth of new opportunities that are out there, which will encourage your brain to interpret the world as a rich world. And in a rich world, you should constantly explore. So I think that's sort of the first step. And, that's probably kind of hard for people when, our mindsets are, given that we're mostly locked down and we're staying in one place, we are, there's a phenotype here in flies that's very well known, and the genetics map onto humans as well. There's kind of sitters who sit in one place and just kind of stick with what they've got, and rovers who are always looking for something better.
Wow. Yep.
In the human brain, we've got to kind of get out of the sitter mindset and become a rover, become a forager. And I think one of the ways to do that is to kind of just make yourself aware of the opportunities. But a second one that I think is really critical is, and this is hard if you're under strict lockdown, but literally getting up and moving around, disengaging from routine drudgery. And I think that the classic way to do that is literally to go out and go for a walk, and that kind of opens your mind and it kind of activates this exploration circuit, which I think would put you in a mode for being ready to search. There are other ways you could do that. You can do that through meditation. You can do that through like vacuuming and doing the dishes, things that let your mind wander and it turns on that system. So I would say that's sort of step number one in just, getting that process moving.
So probably going into the, steps 2 and 3, one of the things that you talk about is the importance of connecting through storytelling. How in both the job search process and maybe even in the interview process, what's the importance? How can people best leverage storytelling to make that connection with either the interviewer, the interview team? Walk us through some things that you've seen or experienced there.
Yeah, that's a super interesting connection you've made there, because I hadn't thought about storytelling in the context of job searches or an interview process, but you're right, it's absolutely critical. So the way that our minds, the way that we communicate best is through storytelling. And what does a good story have, right? I mean, it has to have sort of a beginning, a middle, and an end. And it's great if it has a little bit of detail as well. It's kind of funny. I was working with one of my sons recently on his college applications, and he had to, write his personal story. And the thing we kept coming back to is, like, you need a little bit of detail. You need to actually you need a hook. You need to make it interesting. And I think that would definitely be true in an interview. To tell a story about yourself that is not just sort of some bland set of platitudes, but where there's a real, come up with an event, some obstacle you overcame that is real and tangible, and that will actually somebody will remember, right? I mean, I think that would be really critical. The other thing about storytelling, now one thing about any kind of connection you need to make, whether it's with a teammate or a consumer, a customer that you want to sell something to, or in this case, somebody that you're interviewing with. One of the real objectives there is to get your brains in sync. So to
right.
Really, it's literally a thing that happens. So we talk about getting in sync with people metaphorically, we have, but it turns out that when we really do have a good relationship with somebody that's trusting, when communication is at its highest level, literally our brains go into synchrony, and this even percolates down to our other bodily processes. And one of the things that's been discovered is that there are kind of hacks that you can use to promote brain synchrony. So, one of the most important is to make eye contact with the person that you're interacting with. And I know that can feel challenging. Sometimes it can be threatening if especially if you're nervous, you're in a job interview, you feel like there's a power differential, but it's critically important to make eye contact. That eye contact does a whole bunch of things, but one of the things it does is kind of revs up our social brain network, and it begins to push along this process of physiological synchrony. Other things you can do are And I know these are ideas that have been around in the social psychology literature for a long time, but there's some pretty good neuroscience evidence backing it up, which is that if we engage in kind of mirroring behavior, mirroring facial expressions, some mirroring of posture, gestures, when we do that, that seems like it also promotes or initiates the process of getting your brains in sync. You have to do it in a way that's not like blatantly false or obvious, because our brains are also wired to detect that. So you kind of really have to feel it. So I think it's, you go into that interview and you want to connect with the person or the team that's there, and you do all the things that I just talked about, and it will naturally flow. And hopefully, you generate some synchrony that makes the more positive interaction and the longer lasting memory for that interaction as well.
That's just terrifically interesting, and I'll match your the Clash reference with one from the English Beat, mirror in the bathroom. There is something that eye to eye posturing that makes people feel like they're part of the same tribe that you absolutely could use in a setting like this. I go back to when you talk about storytelling and like the college application that you're working on with your son. One of the most common questions in any interview setting that people flub all the time is, tell us one great thing about the way you work and tell us one thing that's not so great. And of course, everyone defaults to, well, I work too much. That's my biggest fault. Well, that to me is actually the biggest opportunity to really step into that, to really show a little bit of vulnerability, to say, this, I'm not perfect, and really highlight something. Now, obviously, if you murdered someone, probably don't bring that up in the interview, but use something that's business focused. How, and this may be, during the COVID environment, are the same practices of eye contact and mirroring and storytelling, are they still as effective or as relevant in a setting like this, in a virtual setting?
Yeah, I mean, we have to imagine that they are critical still, but this is not the situation our brains evolved or developed to deal with, right? So suddenly overnight, we find ourselves having to create that kind of feeling of team chemistry, but in a two-dimensional environment, in which there's a geometric offset between the camera on your computer and what
That's right.
Actually, it can go horribly awry, because for me to make eye contact with you, which I'm not doing, right, I'm looking at your eyes, but if I want to look like I'm making eye contact with you, I have to look at.
That's right.
So I think that you can do that. I think it's something I practice doing, at least some of the time. It's exhausting, right? So it is. That's one reason why Zoom fatigue is a real thing, because it is, I think, so much more challenging to our senses, especially sight, vision and hearing, because there's just displacement of things, and it's harder to pick up on cues, nonverbal cues, that would be much easier to do if we were in person.
Yeah, and someone I read even in the last couple of weeks that one of the interesting things in this virtual Zoom environment is when you spend time with someone at the office, the water cooler chats, so the hallway chats, you're building social capital, but in these virtual instances, you're actually spending social capital to have very similar experiences. So it does mess with how we're wired a bit.
Absolutely. I mean, I think in general, if you can, if it's safe, if you can intersperse real world interactions. I mean, not necessarily even your business interactions. One of the things we know is that the social brain network. We each have a network in our brains that's dedicated to managing our connections with others, and the sort of healthier and stronger that network is, the better we do at kind of understanding people and predicting them and learning from them and empathizing with them. And this social brain network, like many other networks in the brain, is like a muscle. So the more you use it, the better it works. Literally, it gets
Yep.
bigger and stronger through use. So even if you're going to have to be like the business part of your life is going to take place like this, if you can have some other interactions, really try to use it as much as you can, it stands to reason that it'll be better functioning when you're now kind of doing it the critical but time limited and socially capital intensive Zoom interactions.
That's a great perspective. You also highlight in the book simplicity and the value of simplicity. Is there any application in a job search environment where simplicity is put at a premium, where you really can leverage simplicity to kind of cut through all the clutter of potentially 500 job applicants?
This is a great question. I mean, simplicity is, I think, key to success in many things. It is, despite the fact that our brains have about 80 billion neurons making 100 trillion connections, our brains are surprisingly limited, and they're limited in what they can do because it's just so expensive for each neuron to generate its little electrical message. And so our brains have evolved and developed a lot of hacks around that to be efficient. And one way is just that they sort of simplify. So they kind of extract what's different or what's new about the situation relative to expectations or what the context is, et cetera. So if you can kind of stand out by making something, you don't want to give, say, an employer about 15 different aspects of yourself, right, that you want them to think about. Maybe hone in.
Yep.
2 or 3 like key features and make those very, very clear and make them clear in a way that stands out perhaps from the rest.
That is terrific advice. Well, shifting gears just a little bit, because I can't let you go. There was a part of the book that just jumped out at me that didn't have to do with job searches, but you had some subchapter in there around how brains respond to brands through fMRI scans, and I can't let you go without talking about that, because so many of the people that watch this are also deeply involved in the marketing and branding side of business. So walk them through the either the example you had in the book or just an overview.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question because brands were not invented until the last few hundred years, and they didn't become really prominent until really the last century. And so whatever tools in our brain we're bringing to bear on kind of processing information about brands was there to do something else, right? And so the idea is that, in fact, the way that our brains respond to brands and the companies behind them is using this social brain network, which is what we use to relate to other people. And it's an intriguing hypothesis. I mean, it makes sense from our behavior in this, in that we ascribe personalities to brands, creative brands, rugged brand, et cetera. So we use human terms to talk about them. We say we love our iPhone, right? I hate my, whatever, I hate my car. But so we thought, well, that's one thing what people say, but there's often a major disconnect between what people say and what's happening in their brains. It's just hard to really have access to that, and sometimes we don't want to reveal kind of what we know. And so what we decided to do was to look under the hood directly. So we used brain scans to look at what was happening when people who are Apple iPhone users and Samsung Galaxy users basically heard good and bad news about Apple, the company, and Samsung, the company. And, it was, from a behavioral point of view, is interesting. They both look the same. Like Apple users are like, oh yeah, I feel good when something good happens to Apple. I feel bad when I hear something bad happen to Apple. Same for Samsung customers about their brand. But when you look in their brains, it's like, yeah, it's true for the Apple customers. It's like their brains respond to good and bad news about Apple the same they would about somebody in their family, right? And we see parts of the brain active that are, they're active when you're thinking about your tribe, right? And it's part of your identity. When we look in the brains of Samsung users, despite the fact that they expressed empathy for the brand and a strong social emotional connection. We didn't see anything like that. So their brains were like, whisper silent when they were hearing good and bad news about Samsung. And the only thing we did see, which was really fun, I think, was reverse empathy or Schadenfreude. It's like when Samsung customers heard something bad happen to Apple, then there was kind of a little bit of reward, a little bit in their brains, and vice versa, like a little bit of pain when something bad happened to Apple. And one take home. There's a couple of take home messages from that. One is that often what people say and what their brains are doing, or what their brains would tell us, are different. That's one reason why neuroscience is important, I think, for business, especially consumer psychology. But the other thing is that in this case, it's all about Apple. I mean, Apple's defined the entire marketplace, and so Samsung users are Samsung users mostly because they don't want to be Apple, right? It's the anti-Apple cult.
Yep.
And
Yep.
if you're a third brand coming into this market, who are you going to try to pick off? Don't waste your money on picking the Apple customers off. You'll never.
That's right. There are just so many things I love about that case study. Number one, Apple originally was the upstart innovative brand, and now they're the establishment with other people having Schadenfreude. Number two, there's actually a mind map of what Schadenfreude looks like. I love that judging from the colors and the scans. And number three, in when it all comes down to it, an Apple phone and a Samsung phone are essentially the same thing. I mean, yes, you could noodle around, features and stuff like they're phones that have apps that you can connect with people and play games on, and that people have such literal brain connections, through all of the branding and advertising is just absolutely fascinating to me. Well, any other before we wrap up, any other sage advice from your experience for job seekers who are want to get a leg up on their competitor, or maybe even on the other side of the hiring table?
Yeah, well, that's a good question too. I mean, I think there's like always one big take home message I have for people in terms of they want to have their brain functioning the highest level. They want to be least affected by stress. The best thing you can do for your brain is to exercise. So physical exercise is critical for the health and functioning of your brain, and all these other hacks we talk about. I mean, this is sort of really, we get kind of the most bang for the buck there. And so, and I know it's hard right now if you're stuck inside and it seems boring. Find a way to do it, because and it's the impacts in terms of well-being and mental health are as good as or better than any other pharmacological or other kind of treatment. So exercise your body and exercise your mind too, like we talked about. Get out where you can, meet people safely, outdoors, and I think you'll be far better off for it.
Wow. Well, thank you again, Dr. Platt, for the time. I can tell you right now that anyone who listens to this, watches this, you've helped a lot of people just maintain their competitive edge. So thank you again for the time, and very much look forward to seeing your future work. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.